Hello, I'm Jerri, Fred's wife and primary caregiver. The pandemic has been only a minor irritation compared to everything else that has happened to Fred and I these past 2.5 years. In spring of 2020, Fred went into serious heart failure after 20 years of controlling his enlarged heart with medication. We were faced with 3 choices in the following order. Fred could try to become a candidate for a heart transplant. If that option was not possible, he could try to become a candidate for the implantation of a heart pump called an LVAD, left ventricular assist device. If that option was not possible, the last option was to go home and die in 3 to 6 months. Due to age, the heart transplant was a no-go. But fortunately, on November 7th of 2020, and after much hospitalization and testing, Fred received the LVAD heart pump. Home rehab from that went slow, but went well. He was all set to start outpatient cardiac rehab at Sparrow in June of 2021, but the night before his first session, he passed out on the way to the bathroom. Fred fell, hitting his head extremely hard on the wood floor. I was next to him within seconds, but he was unresponsive and already in a pool of blood. Fred was airlifted to Michigan Medicine, the theme here of Michigan Medicine, I think. Fred was airlifted to Michigan Medicine, and we learned he had suffered a severe brain bleed called a subarachnoid hemorrhage. The brain bleed was made worse because Fred was on blood thinners. After 4 scary weeks in the ICU, followed by 5 weeks in inpatient rehab at Michigan Medicine, Fred finally came home along with a hospital bed, a bedside commode, 2 wheelchairs, a Hoyer lift, a second lift device called a Sarah-Steady, and various other medical equipment and supplies. Our 1,200 square foot home was completely rearranged to fit all the equipment. The only thing left to gather were people to help me with home health care. I called multiple agencies with no luck. After some days of panic and desperation, a friend suggested I reach out to the local MSU nursing school. We, or should I say I, was saved by 5 nursing students that I hired to alternate coming 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening. I don't want to go so far as to say that life was now manageable. That would be a stretch. But I felt like I could at least now manage Fred's care. My own care I was not so sure of. It wasn't just the stress and work of Fred's care. That and not knowing how far Fred would recover put me in a very dark place. What was the rest of my life going to look like? Fortunately, soon after coming home from the hospital, we started Fred's therapy at Origami. One of the first things we learned was the phrase, recovery is a marathon, not a sprint. I think probably a lot of people in here have heard it, and probably their next reaction was, I hate marathons, I want the sprint. But I like to think of our therapists as being marathon coaches, as well as the people along the route of the marathon cheering you on and keeping you fed and hydrated. Yes, it's been a marathon, but we've had tons of excellent coaching and support along the way. And that coaching and support was not just directed at Fred, but also directed at me and my role as caregiver. They treated the whole package and were watching out for both Fred and I. Even though your spouse might be the one with the TBI, it greatly affects you both, although somewhat differently. And those effects carry over to recovery. As your spouse improves and gets better, the caregiver's life also improves and gets better. So yeah, pandemic, piece of cake. TBI and recovery, not so much. But while recovery hasn't been cake, it's been made palatable by our family, friends, and especially the therapists and staff at Origami. So thank you to our 2 adult sons who uprooted their lives for many months while they helped and supported us. Our son Daniel lives in Poughkeepsie, and he said he made 20 trips between Poughkeepsie and our house in East Lansing, which is a 12-hour trip last year. Thank you to our friends who sent cards and flowers to the hotel in Ann Arbor where I lived for 3 months. Thank you to Jane and Tom Bobay and other people from our church who supported us emotionally and still support us emotionally, and also delivered home-cooked meals every Friday for many months after we got home. And of course, thank you to Fred's wonderful therapists, Amy, April, Stephanie, and Jackie, and my wonderful therapist, Amanda Lopez. No words can do justice to your positive impact on our lives. There's where the tears come. I made it this far. I'm really glad. And thank you to all the substitute origami therapists and special programs like Love Your Brain Yoga. For all of this and for Fred's remarkable recovery, we are truly thankful.
During the dress rehearsal yesterday, I made it all the way through without having to sit down, but I'm not guaranteeing it tonight. So, as Jerri suggested, I've been through quite a journey. I was born in early autumn 1949. I died in early summer 2021. I was reborn in early autumn 2021. Between those two times in 2021, I have no memory, though others have told me what was going on and what I was doing. But to me, it's a black hole, the contents of which are only gradually being recovered. So here's about my traumatic brain injury. It left me adrift in many ways. I found myself waking up in September after losing consciousness in June of the same year. I think of it as being lost in my brain in many ways and trying to figure out where I was. One of the disquieting elements was that I really could not tell what was real and what was imagined or dreamed. Some of my false memories were so real to me that I could not tell them from reality. As I now can tell, I had formally retired from my job as a professor just before the TBI, but also had no memory of this fact until much after coming back to consciousness. I read and reread the emails related to my retirement before they finally sank in. I was driving my wife, Jerri, crazy by not realizing the limitations on my ability and wanting to go take a walk or drive to Flint, where I taught at the University of Michigan campus. So far as I knew, I had teaching and other responsibilities there, and I always striven to live up to my responsibilities. As I gradually came back to myself, I found myself wondering why no one had told me what was up. It may be, of course, that I was told and it didn't sink in. Retirement from my professorship left me lost in time in many ways. However, I noted the kindnesses that I felt. Doctors, nurses, therapists, and other medical staff pretty much measured up in this regard. From cardiologists and surgeons down to the people who mopped the floors and changed the linens. Family support was consistent. Jerri's concern and advocacy in my behalf shone through. My son's concern and kindness also. They came and spent time with me, even when I must have been failing to be supportive or very rewarding of their efforts. Now I'm in rehab, and rehab is challenging. Many exercises are designed as games for children, so they're both too easy and too difficult for an adult. Still, I am building structures of meaning and finding new directions. I'm not yet sure exactly where I am going, but I'm going somewhere. At my current age, 72, my prospects were not good. One of my therapists reported that her initial goal was to have me answer simple yes-no questions with 80% accuracy. Another reported that her initial goal was to have me sit successfully on the edge of a bed. The 80% correct answer thing is long in the past. I am sitting up and getting around and walking with minimal assistance. I do use a four-wheeled walker, which is a big advance over the two-wheeled walker I started out with. This thing is trying to trip me, was my continual complaint about it, and I commented on several occasions that it was a useless piece of shit. Fred, always the tactful and supportive patient, not. There was a fair amount of caution in me not to have high expectations. A simultaneous low and high point was reached after several months when I informed my main physical therapist that I had decided that she actually knew what she was talking about. Up until that point, I had been skeptical. Having an involved and intelligent patient seemed to be a plus for therapists. With their help, it kept exceeding their goals for me. The people I worked with were quite invested in pupil success, not just my success. It also helped that my wife, Jerri, was on board with Team Fred and my success. She asked good questions too and learned enough about the therapy process to make intelligent and helpful suggestions. Several therapists suggested that she might make an effective therapist herself if she was interested. Of course she was interested, but it was mostly in my success. I hope not to have to go through any of this again, she commented. We are in strong agreement on that. In some ways, I think it's been harder on her as the result of all of this has not been obvious to her. By contrast, I always figured I was going to be more or less okay. Also, I've had pretty good access to my own thoughts. When I seemed relatively unresponsive, that didn't mean I was uninvolved. When someone asked me a question, I pretty much knew what my answer was, whether it came out of my mouth or not. Becoming realistic about my limitations was also useful. I've already mentioned my intention to get in the car and drive to Flint, which might have had any number of dire results. But to what effect? So what? These are questions worth asking, if not for their inherent worth, but as a part of the searching for the meaning, if any, of the experience of TBI. Or they may just be the meandering of a brain struck in neutral and waiting to be shifted into action. I'm still waiting to discover this, and I'm hoping to return soon to more productive considerations. Well, I'm still lost in my brain. Predicted by my therapist, the return of memory is a pretty marvelous thing, except when it isn't always under my control. This becomes particularly obvious in waking in the middle of the night or just waking a bit early in the morning and letting the memories roll in. Current favorites include the Spanish language, which I haven't much used since my early 20s. I find myself conjugating verbs as I wake and trying to remember obscure vocabulary items. And music. Apparently this is one of the things least likely to disappear with age, brain injury. I looked forward to its return, probably an error on my part. The tenor lines from the Messiah of Handel are nowhere to be heard, nor any other number of other classics. But instead, I seem mostly to remember old camp songs. Boy Scout songs are much like Girl Scout songs. My wife and I discovered when we compare memories. Just change genders, plug in the appropriate summer camp name, and Bob's your uncle. You have access to a whole songbook of tunes and lyrics you would rather not have remembered. Found in rehab. Back to my discussion of rehabilitation. It was confusing, with no very clear direction or progress. My doctors and therapists were very positive about my progress, and it probably was positive for them to have a longer term and more insightful view of my changes over time than I had. It's nice to be their star pupil, but frustrating to lack context for that. Not to have the perspective I had as a professor, able to assure students that they indeed were making progress based on the smallest of indications, because I could see where they were going. Perfection was always what I coached them toward, never a completely achieved perfection. This might be a lesson for me. It's no fun being the student after having spent years as the master of what I was doing with the freedom to pursue whatever direction caught my fancy. I spent the greater part of an hour writing the paragraph just above this, which I normally would have pounded out in a minute or two. This is analogous to my current walks, in which I cover a distance that previously would not have sufficed as a warm-up. Currently, a walk around the block is beyond me. There are payoffs even to my short walks. Recently, Jerri and I did a slow jaunt down a few houses and back, with neighbors walking out to comment appreciatively on what I had just done. The payoff for traumatic brain injury seems to be this greater ability to connect with others on an emotional or personal level. At this point, I'm still lost in transition. There's a lot up in the air as I try to discern how much progress I have achieved and how much is yet to be achieved. This makes for a time of uncertainty that I did not quite expect. The mantra for medical professionals is, 1 year after your TBI, you will have regained 90% of what your recovery will look like. You might have the potential to regain another 5 or 10%, but if it comes, it will be gradual. At the 1 year mark, there are still entirely unforeseeable factors. It would be nice to know more of this unforeseeable stuff. A lot, though, is positive. We've gone away from hiring nursing students to get me up and put me to bed, as Jerry mentioned. They were coming both morning and evening for a couple of hours each. Now they come some mornings, and rather than me filling their time as they get up and get washed up and dressed before having breakfast, we have other uses for them. It once was the case that Jerry would arrive fresh from her shower as I was halfway washed. Now I tend to be up and breakfasting at that point, and we often are able to release the nursing student back into the wild before our full scheduled time has elapsed. In evenings, the students are useful, but no longer entirely necessary. It doesn't require minutes of maneuvering to get me into bed. So instead, the evening helper spends a great deal of her time playing games with us. This is good for morale, as it offers a time of adult interaction, but it also is therapeutic. The board and card games helped me keep my mind active and develop perception and what's called executive function, one of the therapy terms describing high-end reasoning and adaptive skills. Executive function was a weakness for quite some time. It was difficult for me to decide on goals and the steps to achieve each one. Just logging onto my computer and opening email was an ordeal, as was working the TV remote controls and recording programs. This is easier now, though I'm not yet ready to make the quick decisions required by a lot of physical activity, including driving a car. You don't want to see me in a car. Life is not quite normal, but it seems to be moving in that direction. Recently we had an active day with a lot accomplished. For example, the 90-pound wheelchair I had been using was no longer needed, so the University of Michigan picked it up and took it away. All of a sudden, our solar room gained a lot of open floor space. We also gained normality elsewhere. Our new bed arrived last month, and allowing us to get rid of the hospital bed in our living room. Overall, our house is getting back to normal. Me, I'm not so sure. I am still in a phase of 1 step forward and 1 step back. Jerry said, isn't that 1 step forward, or 2 steps forward, 1 step back? And I said, no, it's 1 step forward, 1 step back. My physical therapy continues to make progress, but it doesn't always feel as if this is the case. I often can do more, but don't feel as if I can do more. Energy levels are low, and I seem to be in a near constant state of nap deprivation. But I know I'm a work in progress, and thank everyone for their assistance on my recovery journey. Thank you.